Please give a warm welcome to our last keynote, How Offensive Security Made Me Better at Defense by Dino Zovi from Block.
Cool. Thank you all for staying to the end. I'm really appreciative you all stuck through it because I went through a few of the talks and these are really deep stuff. So basically, there's a lot of thinking, but you don't need to worry. You don't need to think anymore. I'm just going to tell some stories and some jokes. So all the hard part is all done. Time to relax. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how offensive security made me better at defense. Oh, also, I'll say I'm extremely honored to be at OffensiveCon. This is actually my first time, surprisingly. Really appreciate the organizers and really love seeing some old friends here. So extremely happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about how getting good at offensive security also made me better at defense. So kind of a phrase that's pulled out a lot, and I think too much, is what people call the defender's dilemma, which is that defenders have to be right every time. Attackers only need to be right once. I think this is false and BS. Instead, what I like is actually practicing security engineering. And what I call security engineering, which is building systems, like whole systems, maybe it's your organization as a system, maybe it's a product as a system, that are dependable in the face of malice, error, or mischance, as a discipline focused on the tools, processes, and methods needed to design, implement, and test complete systems to adapt existing systems as their environment evolves. This is from Ross Anderson's textbook, which I consider that's kind of what I do and aspire to. However, I mentioned that this was all like, we don't have to think anymore, so this is probably the most text you'll see for a while. We're going to go back to memes, make it easy and digestible. So defender's dilemma? Nah. Security engineering? Yeah. However, Drake has been pwned pretty badly, so we're gonna go with Kendrick instead. And I'll phrase it this way: never done exploits, they not like us. And so I'm going to talk about how someone who spent a lot of time writing exploits approaches defense. So if you don't know who I am, I'm going to go a little bit over kind of my journey and how I ended up doing defensive security engineering. So I was what I'll call a hacker punk kid in the 90s. And this is me at my first DEF CON 7. Got to play in the Capture the Flag and spent pretty much the entire weekend just doing that. And back then, it wasn't a team sport that it is today. You literally just put your name on a clipboard, they gave you an IP address, and you got to go to town. And that was the first year that an entire team won, and that was the Ghetto Hackers. But I was pretty proud that I got second place, working by myself and staying up all night to do these things. You'll see this is a familiar trend of me staying up all night and hacking on stuff. So, I went back after that to the startup that I worked at and kind of rode the dot-com boom and bust cycle. And after the bust, I went back to working at Sandia National Labs, where I had a internship during high school and early college. I was doing like Unix programming back then, but this time I ended up actually finally being able to focus on security. And so I was their hacker kid. And you can see that I've upgraded to a new laptop, but I have the same old bad posture. And so this was kind of the first time I learned like a structured way to think about attacks. And back then, what was interesting to me is they had this structured methodology of attack graphs and analyzing things. And I was like, I have remote root, start node, end node. Why do I need a fancy picture? I have compromised the entire thing. And this photo was taken on an engagement where, when I first with them, I flew out on a red eye from Las Vegas. I was at DEF CON right before, and showed up, and just this was open source, unclassified stuff. But it was I found like I had a fresh look at the system, found a command injection over Java RMI, and just owned everything on like no sleep. And then I was like, okay, my work here is done. I'm good. And that's kind of how I got my start. I did some penetration testing at Stake, Matasano. Eventually went to kind of run security at a quantitative hedge fund. But even while I was doing that, I still couldn't kind of put away my hacker roots. And so there was this thing called Pwn to Own. So Dragos, the organizer of CanSec West, he kept hearing people saying, look, there's all these people saying that like Mac is insecure, but where are the vulns, where are the exploits? like put up or shut up. And so he bought, 2 brand new top-of-the-line laptops, MacBooks, or I think it was MacBook Pros, and said, here are the rules. The first one, attack it over the network, get root, you get that one. And then the second one is going to be a browser bug, exploit the browser from the local network or from an email, and then you'll get that one. And so they announced that, and I was like, oh, that sounds cool. But I didn't actually, go to Kansas West that year because I had kind of too much stuff at work to do. And after the first day, no one had won the first laptop. And so one of my friends called me up. He's like, dude, you should win this contest. And I was like, yeah, maybe. And what I know he knew was that I was sitting on a remote root exploit for Mac OS X at the time. And he's like, dude, you should do that. And I'm like, nah, that one's mine. But I'll see if I can find a new one. And I was like, oh, all I have to do is find a browser bug, right? I'll just do that. And so I stayed up all night again. And a couple years prior, I had found a bug in QuickTime for Java for Mac OS X that was like they had their kind of this version of JNI that let you do like dynamic linking at runtime. And you could do RCE pretty trivially from that. And so I was like, oh, well, there's one bug, there's usually more, so let's take a look at this. And so I kind of dove in again. And again, after working a whole work day and just sitting in my apartment in New York after getting his call, I was like, yeah, let's just start disassembling some stuff and looking around. And I think maybe around 4 or 5 in the morning, I think I found this. And I was like, oh, that's sketchy. That's not going to work. That's a bunch of signed Java integers and so on. And then I saw that they did actually have some bounds checking in how they were checking the lengths and such for these buffers before they're calling a mem copy. And I was like, yeah, that's also not going to work. And so this is the actual exploit I wrote that night. So as you might see, what it took to win Pwn to Own in 2007, way simpler than it takes now. So this is relatively simple. There's like a class called QtHandle that basically allocates like a QuickTime buffer. It's on the Java heap, and then you get a QuickTime pointer, but you still don't know where it is on the heap. And rather than do a bunch of heap manipulation, there's this cool qtobject.id method. And what did they use for the ID? Well, the actual pointer to the buffer. And so then I could basically turn this into a write-for primitive pretty easily. And so after I did that, I just basically splat it all over the stack and, game over. It works well enough for one night and to win this contest. So I did that. That was kind of fun. Then a couple years after that, Alex Soderov and I were Charlie Miller's backup band, backup singers, I don't know what you want to call it, for No More Free Bugs. What we did is Charlie Miller did a lightning talk at Kansas West, and I wrote a blog post about this. And this is a little while ago, so you might not remember the time. Some of you remember, but there's a time before bug bounties, before a lot of things that we understand today. And so we were saying, hey, instead of just finding these bugs and reporting them to the vendor for free, how about, I don't know, how about there be bug bounties? How about there be stuff like that? And it was pretty fun because we got called, I think, extortionists by a lot of people. And Charlie's a lot more bold than I am. So we wrote a book together, a couple books together. And so we're at the kind of the publishers, whatever thing at RSA. And I'm trying to blank on his name. We're talking about a real well-known security guy was there who called us cyber extortionists, and Charlie just walks up to him and was like, hi, I'm Charlie and Dino. You called us cyber extortionists. And it was really awkward, but it was fun. So, did the kind of, that kind of vuln research thing for a few years. But then around 2013-14, I did a pivot. And so what I moved to then is what I'll call defensive security engineering. And started to work for a company called Square, and they had this bold idea that they wanted to use the same hardware that they sold in the US for EMV internationally in chip and pin markets. And they said, we don't want to build a pin pad, we don't want to build a display, why don't we just use the mobile device that the thing is paired to. And we actually created a relatively innovative way of doing that and created a PCI payment standard. And so now there's not just us, but there's many others that allow use of low-cost chip card readers with a pin entry on the screen. And I was like, this is kind of cool. I get to use low-level systems internals knowledge and kind of first principles security thinking to enable small businesses. And like that was something that was like, I don't know, really energizing to get behind. And especially because my mother used it too. After a few years of that, I had an idea for how to do EDR on Linux using Linux tracing. Like eBPF was a kind of a blog post back then, but most customers' kernels weren't running it, so we used Linux perf events instead. But the idea was make something like an EDR that was high performance, extremely high reliability, not using a kernel module so you don't crash the world or anything like that. And make that for like Linux servers. So that was a company called Capsulate, eventually got acquired by Sophos. After that, went back to Square and became a company called Block, and now I run what we call our Applied Security Engineering Organization, where we do everything from secure our peer-to-peer payments app, still work on the secure hardware for accepting payments, Bitcoin hardware wallet, doing tap to pay directly to iOS and Android devices, and all of the back-end HSM infrastructure for accepting payments and cryptocurrency operations and stuff like that. So that's kind of my perspective and like my framing. And I talk a little bit more about how offensive understanding really helps defend. So hopefully some people remember this movie. This is what I call attacker math, where cybersecurity is an economics game between attacker and defender. And whoever has the most understanding and the most leverage wins. And I gave a presentation about this in 2011 to try and talk about it, and it was extremely focused on, I would say, the mindset of someone doing vuln research and exploit development, and what choices they would make and what the incentives are. And so kind of using like an attack graph to try and show people who are more visual thinkers than I, you'll notice the theming of my slides is very Spartan. I'm not a very visual person. Basically, what choices would one make? At this time, this is pretty old days. Chrome 10 still used WebKit, hadn't called it Blink yet. Still used JavaScript core. And you looked at like the browser landscape, and you could say, all right, I'm going to build a couple primitives, find a vulnerability, and then I'll still get sandboxed execution on on Windows, or I can just find a Java vulnerability. I can get target all three major browsers for free, and I get medium integrity native code execution. And what I was trying to explain for largely defenders who haven't done this sort of work is how to think about what things are more likely than others, which for an attacker are pretty natural. You can say, oh, well, if you're developing, doing offensive security, you can say, this is a whole ton of work. Why am I going to do that? I'm going to do this instead. And most people who haven't done that sort of work don't really have that intuitive understanding yet. And similarly, for once you get code execution in a browser, you can look at things and say, all right, well, I can look for a sandbox escape and then an LPE and then maybe like a userland LPE, and then I need to do all these other things. Or I can just exploit the kernel. If I have the attack surface and the vulnerability, I'll just go there. And then I have most of what I need. And then I just need to look for persistence, which ironically, back then wasn't as much of an issue, but with modern systems like iOS, establishing persistence is a whole nother feat. And another thing I look back at, so I would say the litmus test of a keynote speaker is for every prediction they make, you need to look back 15 years prior and see how true it is. And so back then, this was 2011, the term APT was only really publicly used in 2010. And so that's when the industry kind of went from so the information security industry went from focusing on very common like mass malware type of threats to actually talking about APT in just about every sentence. So you can see why I'm still using scare quotes here. But my theory was everyone has a boss and a budget. Everyone is resource constrained by certain resources, and this is the system of incentives that guide their actions. And so like targeted attacks must scale according to the resources at the attacker's disposal. And if you understand what resources they have a lot of versus what they don't have a lot of, you can kind of predict, have a reasonable prediction of their path through an attack graph. And we'll see how that held up. And so the perspective that I've built and kind of conclusion I've come to working in kind of the general tech industry for the last 10 plus years is there's still a lot of things we think are O-day, but it's never 0 day. It's never O-day, except when it is. But we'll ignore that for a moment. But it's almost never. And the reason is because O-day doesn't fall from the sky. It's not magic. It's talent and sweat. It takes time and skill and energy. So there's not an infinite supply of reliable exploits for 0 day vulnerabilities. And one of my pet peeves is when someone uses the phrase "found an exploit," because I'm like, "Found it? Well, maybe you find it on your own system, but like, this stuff takes work, man. Like, you don't just find it. That's like, it's months." And so when you build that, when you factor that in, you kind of understand what's likely and what's not likely. And what I've encountered is a lot of people have a very, I would say, conspiratorial, kind of very, ungrounded from reality threat model. And the reason is because there's not a lot of information they can point to make reasonable and rational choices. So it's not their fault. And, things that public information is kind of hard to come by. So things that I would point to over the years are, this is 2019 Zerodium's like periodic table of prices and such. And I could point to it and say, look, they're paying, double for this versus that. Clearly there's work there. There's scarcity. If there's not work and scarcity, the price would be $1. And then people can rationally think about like, oh, maybe it's not worth, if you have like full chain and other things, like maybe it's not worth a few $1 million for this exploit. And the other point I usually make is that like these aren't infinitely usable. Basically every use confers some chance of discovery. And there's not a lot of good information there that you can point to, but it can help us make better choices. But also I want to point out this is 2019 prices. So with like post-pandemic inflation and stuff, I think each of these are like umpteen quadrillion dollars now. So you'll have to modify that a little bit. But if you look at data from like Google's threat intelligence teams, they're finding relatively constrained use of 0 days exploited in the wild. And of course, I don't believe that Google is seeing everything, but I believe they probably have some of the best visibility to give some, I don't know, maybe I'll call it a proxy measurement or some approximate measurement that you can make choices with and point out that, yeah, it's not going to happen everywhere. It's probably not going to happen to us. It might, but you never know. And with the same amount of visibility that they have over the web, you can see kind of relative numbers between platforms that are used to browse the web, and see kind of what the estimate a little bit of likelihood of some of these events. Vulncheck has slightly better data, slightly more full. What I like about this data is showing just the massive growth of CVEs up to 30,000 in 1 year, but all the data they have from CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities, Shadow Server, and other organizations, they're only finding about 550 are actually exploited in the wild. That's 0 day and known vulnerabilities. And that's about 1.1%. What I think is really interesting about that number is I thought, what's another proxy measurement that might have some bearing on this? And I looked at the attendance of RSA this year, and it was 44,000 people. And I looked at the attendance of OffensiveCon this year, and it's about 600 people, which is about 1.5%. So kind of interesting coincidence of how much is talking about CVEs versus what actually compromises systems to kind of ground these things in reality. So I kind of found that was interesting. But let's talk about something that actually happened and a case study that kind of conveniently makes my point. So in the last few months, the largest theft in history, not just digital, but in history, was committed against a cryptocurrency exchange called Bybit. And they took, I think, 440,000, can't remember exactly how many Ethereum, which is roughly 1.5 billion US dollars. So in euros today, what is that, 6 million euros? US dollars going, a little adjustment going on right now. But let's talk about sort of how this worked. And this event was not without precedent because the same threat actor had also attempted to steal $1 billion from the Bangladesh National Bank several years prior. And there's a lot of interesting similarities between them. And because this one was a little older, there's some things, we have a little more information about it now we can look at. So a pretty classic kind of attack path. But what's interesting is, so the information gathering was largely over LinkedIn. The compromise was largely over LinkedIn and social engineering. And then I think they opened a file attachment. I couldn't find out if they had revealed whether it was actually an exploit or something a little more mundane, like an Office macro. I'd bet on Office macro personally. And then they were able to pivot around the organization. I think a little zero-day was used around there. But once they got to the Swift system, they actually had some interesting, highly specific malware specific to their objectives. And that was performing the Swift transactions and also hiding the evidence of it from the generated reports. And so it's not super crazy, but there's a embedded Oracle local database, and they're basically just modifying that to obscure and hide and remove the traces of the transactions. So this is kind of 2016, and when I read about this, I kind of adjusted my mental threat model. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that's pretty interesting. And now let's go back to today. So this is what Bybit used to protect their Ethereum wallets, some software called Safe Wallet, which I believe is actually mostly made here in Berlin. So what it lets you do is it lets you have what's called multi-sig. So you kind of have multiple signers, and you can configure them and say, any transaction requires a confirmation of N of M signers. So pretty decent, pretty good for certain threats. I'm looking after the fact through the documentation on the software and looking for things that, in hindsight, you could say, that seems like a bad idea. And how did this happen? Because I was kind of following along when this happened, because this was actually announced. This breach occurred when I was on vacation, so I'm like literally on the beach reading about this. I'm like, oh, I wonder if they did that. I wonder if they did that. And some people read books on the beach. This is what I do. But basically, it lets you attach, lets you use a hardware wallet to sign it. But I was like, and this is what the Ledger Nano looks like. It's like a small kind of a large USB key form factor. But I'm like, wait, sign cryptocurrency transactions on a hardware wallet connected over web USB to an internet-connected browser? That does not seem like a great idea, because I know how browsers work. And are you telling me cross-site scripting can be used to steal cryptocurrency now? This seems really bad. But it actually gets interestingly worse in some ways, because here's the kind of the flow that someone using the software would go through is they'd have a transaction they need to approve, and then they need to click through many transactions on this ledger, and we're going to count how many clicks it takes to approve this transaction to just make this a little more real. So let's count with me. 1, 2, no one's counting with me. This is a little weird. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. 17 clicks. And so when you have to do that, you're probably not going to pay too much attention to it. Or you might find this support article that says, yeah, having to click up to 17 times on a hardware wallet is a drag. Here's how you configure it to just one click. Open up the Ethereum app on your ledger and basically turn it into what is called blind signing mode. So instead of having to approve 17 times, you only have to approve once, but there's so much information in the smart contract transaction that you are not visually confirming, so they recommend not turning it off. But I still have limited confidence in people confirming that, because what are you going to do? Recompute the hashes on pencil and paper? I think there's still a lot of limited efficacy that you can get from that. But looking at this, you're like, I seems like a bad idea. Do you want ants? This is how you get ants. So how do I think this attack kind of went down? Well, we do know at this point that it started with a social engineering attack against the Safe Wallet developers. And it's an open source project, so you can find who the developers are pretty readily on GitHub. And although I didn't do this specifically, I would bet that a number of emails for them are in the Git log, in the Git history. And what the threat actor did is they basically had they did the LinkedIn recruiter lure, which would basically they would target them asking if they wanted a job and wanted to apply for this job. So they sent job descriptions and a question sheet, and then those sheets would get them to download a GitHub repository in order to complete the challenge, the coding challenge for the interview, or even to earn an interview, and then that would sort of proceed with the attack. And so here's an example of one of the lures, and it's saying, hey, download this GitHub repo, make some modifications to it, and then describe how to do it. So of course, pretty much every programmer, especially with this, is going to run it, and that's where the problem begins. So this is a little subtle. So what the Python application did is it would just hit a backend API and then load the YAML. So be honest, does anyone know the actual issue here? It's highlighted in red, but why? Okay. Yes, exactly. It's the unsafe loader. So basically, when you specify loader equals a YAML.loader, it uses the deprecated old behavior. And so even though the PyYAML is up to date, and you read the requirements.txt, I think it's requirements.txt, basically everything's up to date, no red flags there. If you don't spot this, you're basically giving an RCE backdoor. And so that's exactly what it was. And so then it turned into what the C2 server did is it would send an in-memory payload to just do kind of pretty basic info stealer stuff, grab the AWS secret access key, which are not device bound, so you can just take it and use it somewhere else, and so on and so on. And what they actually did was they're able to get direct access to the S3 bucket that hosted the compiled front-end JavaScript for the web application. So then, just modify the JavaScript for whatever you want. And so where a transaction is normally executed, there's some, I won't call it obfuscated JavaScript, but terse JavaScript to verify whether it is Bybit making the transaction based on their wallet addresses, and if so, replace the transaction. So what it does is it checks, if we're Bybit or if we're not Bybit, just do the transaction requested. If we are Bybit, sign this transaction instead. So the same web application delivered to all of however many signers that Bybit had, they would all be blind signing the malicious transaction rather than the one they expected and the one that the UI showed them. And there's a lot of analysis over this incident that focused on the money laundering that was done afterwards. Because if you steal like $1.5 billion of Ethereum, you have to do some way to, to obscure that. You have to do a bunch of stuff to obscure that, to obscure the origin of that. But what that told me is that people didn't really know how they did this for a while. So I was speculating, and this is when I started looking into like how this worked, and I was like, oh wait, there's a JavaScript library that uses web USB to talk to the ledger. I'm like, oh no, that sounds bad. And I started just kind of guessing, or I'm like, yeah, I would probably change this function right here, but I was wrong, but it was another function, but it was, pretty similar idea of just like swapping the other transaction. And predictably, this is what happens. Sorry, otherwise I know there's a big club scene in Berlin. I'll keep this going, but if I did that, everyone would just turn into a dance party. But we have serious business to attend to for now. But when I look at this whole attack path, what stood out to me is that there were no actual remote vulnerabilities were exploited. The RCE over YAML wouldn't call it a vulnerability so much as like a subtle subtle nuance of the code. Because it acted as, by design. There were no local privilege escalation vulnerabilities that were exploited because you don't need to escalate privileges to read the AWS creds out of home/AWS. No persistent malware was needed. It was just an in-memory payload and just kept executing. And for Bybit, this was effectively a software supply chain attack against Bybit via the browser. There's not really anything that I could reasonably imagine that EDR would see or really be able to hook into, short of hooking into the entire JavaScript execution. And that would be pretty slow, so I don't think anyone's doing that. And so people were doing, like, a lot of, even today, like, I look at a lot of the analysis of, like, this attack, and they say, oh, here's all these things that you should do X, Y, and Z, and I'm like, but none of those things would have prevented this. It's like, oh, in order to prevent this attack, brush your teeth 3 times a day instead of twice. It's like, that's not connected to it at all. Like, so it is I think, relatively clever that a lot of these steps are sort of seemingly chosen to avoid creating artifacts that things like EDR will detect, because it's pretty commonplace now. So this is this kind of segue into how I take this, and also I would point out that for that one, like, I still can find any traces of where ODE was needed, any malware was needed. It's really just trust chaining and like kind of old school hacking, but doing it really fast. It happened over about 2 days. And this carries into how I think about defense now. So after having done enough thinking about security from the adversarial or offensive side, I can say, oh yeah, I just do this, and it might not always be correct, but I can have an intuition of roughly how difficult it would be to do something like this. And so when I see unbound authentication tokens that are bearer tokens, or that you can just take and still use to produce signatures, because they're not device bound, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty easy for malware to do. And as we move more things to the cloud, you don't actually need malware on the host as much anymore. Just take those and do the thing to the cloud. Does that cloud have good audit logs? Does it, because we're moving from mobile device to desktop, or moving with a mobile device moving from cell to Wi-Fi to location, hopping IP addresses within the same geographic region is expected for those tokens. So an attacker doing the same thing is not going to stand out. And so I try but these things jump out at me, but what I'm really trying to do is figure out how to teach an entire organization to think like this without having to spend 15 years basically thinking about it from this. So the tools that I go back to are ironically the kind of graph-based sort of attack graphs that I learned kind of at the beginning of my career and dismissed as being kind of too simplistic for how attacks are. But now attacks are typically multi-step, or more commonly multi-step, so that sort of graph-based thinking is a little more applicable and a little more useful, even for a cynic like me. And I've just changed what I'm cynical about. Now I'm like, oh, this is good, other things are bad. And the way I think about this is I look at where a lot of the defensive cybersecurity industry thinks and focuses, and they're all at the leaves. And almost all of that is probably the least likely to defend against the exact tactic that the attacker is going to do, because the attacker has so many more choices. And I call it either I could turn left or I could turn right. It's really an aspect of style, but if the entire defensive world expects attackers to do it, go left, going right is equal amount of work, but it's going to just move past a lot of those things. And so what I look at is, how do I increase defensive leverage closest to the attacker goal, so that basically I don't have to be guessing correctly. At this point, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that things like browsers can be exploited, workstations can be exploited, credentials can be stolen, all these things, and it's just many different ways how, and it's a lot of tedious kind of whack-a-mole to me, whereas you get closer to the end node, you can actually have a lot more leverage. And one of my other kind of soapboxes is that detection and response is not enough. In a lot of companies and a lot of the industry, people rely heavily on detection and response. And that's not to say we shouldn't have it, we just should pretend it's not there. So my perspective is, we should have it, it should be effective, but I should pretend there's no safety net. If I think there's a safety net, I'm going to over-rely on it and then take risks that I shouldn't. So this is this photo, which reminds me of detection and response, is a fire lookout station in Washington State in the U.S. If you've ever read Jack Kerouac, this is where he spent a year when he wrote Desolation Angels and went kind of nuts. Because I think for a lot of us, we were like, oh, it'd be so great to spend a lot of time alone in this cabin, and I'm going to finish all those things I want to finish. Then 3 or 4 months in, it starts to get a little batty. But the role of this lookout station is just to look out over a large section of forest, and when there's a fire, you just call and report the fire. And you can't do anything about it, but you can say, oh, there's a fire over there. It's big or it's small. It's all you got. And in some ways, sometimes detection is getting closer to that, in my opinion. And the other risk we have with over-relying on detection and response. So this is from the Palisades Fire in LA, which is a very tragic situation and personally connected to a lot of people that I know and work with. That the fire response capability was overwhelmed. The fire was so large, there were so many houses that were burning that the fire department basically just did their best, but there was almost nothing they could do. And what I think a lot about is, I'm gonna go back on my promise. I promised the organizers I would not speak about AI, let Perry speak about AI, but I'm gonna go back on it and speak about AI for 15 seconds. I have a theory that AI is gonna actually make offensive operations a lot faster and a lot more scalable, a lot sooner than it makes offensive engineering, what I'll call it, faster and more scalable. So what I worry about is the equivalent of taking a human to a robot war. Basically, if we are having kind of a detection and response cycle, assuming a dwell time of 2 years or even like 3 months, and instead the threat is basically speed is the new stealth of fanning out in parallel as much CPU as you can throw at it, agents with tool use against your organization, just using them. You basically have as many people running a playbook as you want, and that can quickly overwhelm almost anyone's detection and response capability. And so we need to think about kind of what we're going to do in advance of that and get working on it yesterday, basically. But so that's one of the areas where I think about detection and response is makes me a little nervous, and shouldn't rely on it too much. But what I think is important is to remember that this is why we have engineering. So this is in the Palisades Fire, there's a few houses that were mysteriously left standing when everything else burned around them. And it wasn't, a mystery. It was actually engineering. It was fire protection engineering, fire safety engineering. And so this house in particular had a number of mechanisms built in, like this buffer zone around the house with nothing flammable, so that even if all the houses around it are, if there's flames all around it, the fire is not going to spread. And unlike many houses that have attics with basically, air intake at the top, this house was completely air sealed, mostly for other environmental reasons, but it also had fire protection benefits. So what that did is that prevented embers, from going into it. But why did they build something like that? Well, because 90% of houses catch fire from embers coming into or at least in the US, coming into the attic and starting the fire from within. And so eliminating that design reduces a lot of risk. And also the overhangs from the roof are short. The materials are also really innovative. One thing that people might notice is they might say, wait, why did that not catch fire? It appears to be made of wood. And strangely enough, wood is a lot more resistant, like good timber is a lot more resistant to fire than steel. And so actually, especially with modern mass timber, you can actually build more safely, like with the right structural properties and better fire protection than a lot of other materials. So it's an example to me of this is what we want. We want basically, even if everything else is getting burned down, we want to have one place where we know is not going to get burned down. And so what I think, and how I look at this, the maturity of how we analyze defense, it reminds me a lot of Galileo's, from the title, I think it's Two New Sciences. His book, basically, I'll call it talking about proto-physics. It's very anecdotal. It's kind of a dialogue between Galileo at 3 stages of his life with 3 different character names. But he's talking about principles of physics, but in a very intuitive way, and saying, here's where the load is, and the stresses of the structure are felt, and here's how to build things stronger. But it's not quite in a engineering way yet. And maybe 50 years after this, Newton came out with Principia Mathematica, and basically that's where we're starting to develop physics and can develop the right tools to properly analyze structures and do proper engineering. I think that's where we are with defense right now. We have a lot of intuition, we have a lot of judgment, but that doesn't scale. But this isn't the only place where we have this problem. We found tools to do this, and so I was looking at I look at other fields and how they've approached this. And so this is what's called an event tree. This is used for nuclear safety. This is used for aviation safety. And just to find how events cascade and what should happen in response. And the challenge with applying this is that the basis is on mean time between failure. And so you can calculate probabilities of things. But because cybersecurity is an economics game, I fundamentally believe that probability doesn't really come into play. It's really about the value to the attacker, the cost to them of the attack, and the cost of one target relative to others, and those incentives. Probability is better for natural occurring rather than human-initiated events. But these, turn into interesting. You can take event trees, turn them into an interesting structure of a fault tree, and with fault trees, I'm starting to see this is actually can give some predictive value, because if you ignore the probability, you can see, how different faults cascade, and and kind of divide up certain subsystems to various security goals and compose those into a larger system. I think a good structured way to apply this in the, I'll say modern software and modern cloud operations, is with fault domain analysis for cloud reliability. And with this kind of analysis, you can see, how failures of components either cascade, or you have redundancy to allow that to fail gracefully. Ones you can ignore, and then these different levels to see how these failures either cascade or are handled by a higher level. And this is becoming pretty common for cloud reliability operations. But what you find in what I found in working in tech companies is that the closer that you can speak a language to an engineering language that engineers are already using, the faster the conversation is going to go, because you're not requiring them to learn your language. You're the security expert. But basically, if they have to learn your language, it's going to add more cognitive load. And when people have too much cognitive load, they just don't do the thing. And so you're not going to make as much progress as if you can, I found, basically adapt what you're doing into a language and a framework that they already know. So when I see teams already doing this, I say, aha, but we're just going to do this for security instead. It already fits the same framework, and instead of a availability fault, we're going to think about a security fault instead. And so what I've been doing is sort of creating different views of how to do fault domain analysis for security. And so for for all of us, we can look at this and see what is applicable to, a vulnerability being exploited. This is what I call a security domain. This is a security a component that enforces a security boundary. So OS kernel, if you subvert the kernel, all of a sudden you're across that boundary. And this basically, when you analyze your system in terms of these security boundaries and security domains, you can estimate how many vulnerabilities and exploitations are required to achieve an attacker goal. And just say, all right, what should our threshold be? Should it be 3? Should it be 5? Should it be 7? And that's where you choose your risk tolerance of how many zero-day exploits it takes to achieve the attacker's goal. An access domain is effectively the things that a human principal can access. What I see, pretty commonly is you have the same administrators for your Okta domain, I'm sure they call it, setup, and same thing with your Active Directory domain. And then that's one person or one team that has access to both of these. Well, if someone gets access onto their workstation or their credentials or however that's secured, you have access to both. So they're the same thing. They're not meaningfully separated. And I even go further with a supply domain of that is the vector of a software supply chain attack. And if someone is able to subvert either software or hardware upstream, what is the scope of impact that can have, and how do we separate things? So we might do things like say, all right, let's have one component of a signature verified in a full AWS stack. Let's have another verified in a full GCP stack, and basically have redundancy across these two things. And when you can translate things to this, I found that it becomes a little more tractable for others to analyze that haven't spent a lot of time kind of in the low-level reverse engineering, vulnerability development sort of thing. And it also helps you develop strong separation of duties. And you can, this is just, separation of duties is actually a really classic idea. This is what a lot of kind of, I'll say, bureaucratic processes are meant to do. However, the problem is these are usually all implemented on systems on one Active Directory domain. And so you're not actually getting meaningful separation from attacks when the underlying, like an attacker can basically perform one attack and subvert all these different separation. But the principle, I think, still holds. And we can create these invariants that I call, don't cross the streams of this must be completely separate from that, must be completely separate from that. And we just make sure from top to bottom that it actually is separate. Otherwise, the whole thing can be subverted. And finally, the thing that I'll leave with that I think really applies to how defense can level up and what I learned from offense is that the best attackers develop their own tools. The best attackers don't just take what's off the shelf and just use it without any understanding of what it does. We have a word for that. But what I see a lot of even top-tier organizations doing is exactly that for defense. They are taking what they bought. They are taking what's available in the common market. They are taking the products that your attackers clearly can also get and find their ways around. And if you're doing that, the best that you hope to defend against is an attacker that is only using very, I'll just say like Metasploit or something like that, very commodity off-the-shelf attack tooling. If you want to defend against attackers that have the capability to write their own tooling or even today instruct an LLM to generate equivalent tooling to the thing that's already been signatured, you need to build. You need to be an engineer. And so this is what I think, part of the perspective I bring from my time working on offensive security is that when you build your own tools, it helps you win. If you want to be a defender and you want to win, you got to build stuff. So that's all I got. Thank you very much.